Suddenly, the BFG gave a jump in the air. "By gum frog," he cried, "it is just having the most whoopee-sniffling idea." "What?" Sophie said. "Wait," he cried. "Hold your horsey feathers. Keep your skin on. Just you wait to see what I is going to bring about." He galloped off, fast to his cave, with Sophie hanging on tight to the rim of the pocket. He rolled back the stone. He entered the cave. He was very excited. He was moving quickly. "You stay where you is my pocket, Huggabee," he said. "He is going the lovely bit of beeswaxing both together. He laid aside the dream catching you, but hung on to the suitcase. He ran across to the other side of the cave and grabbed the long trumpet thing, the one he had been carrying when Sophie had first seen him in the village. With the suitcase in one hand and the trumpet in the other, he dashed out the cave. "What is he up to now?" Sophie wondered. "Keep your head up good," the BFG said. "When you will get a fine winkle of what is going on." When the BFG came near to the sleeping giants, he slowed his pace. He began moving softly. He crept on his toes towards the ugly brutes. They were still snoring loudly. They looked repulsive, filthy, diabolical. The BFG tiptoed around them. He went past the Gizzard Gulper, the Blood Bottler, the Meat Treater, and the Child Chewer. Then he stopped. He had reached the Flesh on Peter. He pointed at him. Then he looked down at Sophie and gave her a pink wink. He knelt on the ground and very quietly he opened the suitcase. He looked out of it the glass jar containing the terrible nightmarish Trochanopter. At the point, Sophie guessed what was going to happen next. "Ouch," she thought. "This could be rather dangerous." She crouched lower in the pocket so that only the top of her head and her eyes were showing. She wanted to be ready to duck out of sight very fast should anything go wrong. They were about 10 feet away from the flesh on Peter's face. The snoring noise he was making was disgusting. Every now and again a big bubble of spit formed between his two open lips, and man, it would burst with a splash and cover his face with saliva. Taking infinite care, the BFG unscrewed the top of the glass jar and dipped the squealing, squirming, faintly scarlet Trochanopter into the wide end of his long trumpet. He put the other end of the trumpet to his lips. He aimed the instrument directly at a flesh on Peter's face. He took a deep breath, puffed out of his cheeks, and then woof, he blew. Sophie saw a flash of pale red go darting towards the giant's face. For a split second it hovered above the face. Then it was gone. It seemed to have been sucked up the giant's nose, but it had all happened so quickly, Sophie couldn't be sure. "We had better be skittling away quick to where it is safe," the BFG whispered. He trotted off for about 100 yards, then he stopped. He crouched to the earth. "Now," he said, "we is waiting for the gun and flames to begin. They didn't have long to wait. The air was suddenly pierced by the most fearful roar Sophie had ever heard, and she saw the flesh from Peter's body, all 54 feet of it, rise up off the ground and fall back again with a thump. When it began to wriggle and twist and bounce about in the most violent fashion, it was quite frightening to watch. "Ew!" roared the flesh pump Peter. "Ow! Ew!" "He's still asleep," the BFG whispered. "The terrible drug-lumping nightmare is beginning to hit him." "Serves him right," Sophie said. She could feel no sympathy to his great brood who ate children as though they were sugar lumps. "Save us!" screamed the flesh lump Peter, thrashing about madly. "He's after me! He's getting me!" The thrashing of limbs and the waving of arms became more violent by the second. It was an awesome thing to watch such a massive creature having such mighty convulsions. "It's Jack!" bellowed the flesh lump Peter. "It's the grateful, crunchiest Jack! Jack is after me! Jack is swag-cracking me! Jack is spice-skin me! Jack is splash-bulking me! It isn't a terrible nightmare. The flesh lump Peter was riding about over ground like some colossal tortured snake. "Oh, spare me, Jack!" he yelled. "Don't hurt me, Jack!" "Who is that Jack he is on about?" Sophie whispered. "Jack is the only human being all giants is frightened of," the BFG told her. "They is all absolutely terrified of Jack. They is all hearing that Jack is a famous giant killer." "Save me!" screamed the flesh lump Peter. "Have mercy on this poor little giant. The beanstalk, he is coming at me with his terrible spike-sticking beanstalk. Take it away! It is begging you, Jack. I pray not to touch me with your terrible spike-sticking beanstalk." "Us giants," the BFG whispered, "is not knowing very much about this dreaded human being called Jack. He is knowing only that he is a famous giant killer and that he is owning something called a beanstalk. We is knowing also that a beanstalk is a fearsome thing and Jack is using it to kill giants." Sophie couldn't stop smiling. "What is your crickling at?" the BFG asked her, slightly nettled. "I'll tell you later," Sophie said. The awful nightmare had now gripped the great brood to such an extent that he was tying his whole body into knots. "Do not do it, Jack," he screeched. "I was not eating you, Jack. I has never eaten human beings. I swear I has never gobbled a single human being in all my wholesome life." "Liar," said BFG. Just then, on the flesh lump Peter's flaming face caught the still fast asleep mad-dripping giant smack in the mouth. At the same time, one of these furiously thrashing legs kicked the snoring, gyro-sculpting giant right in the guts. Both the injured giants woke up and leaped to their feet. "He is swinging me right in the mouth," yelled the meat-driper. "He is bunk-working me smack in the guts," shouted the gizzard glopper. The two of them rushed at the flashlamp Peter and began pounding him with their fists and feet. The wretched flashlamp Peter woke up with a bang. He awoke straight from the one nightmare into another. He roared into a battle, and in the bellowing, tramping rough and tumble that followed. One sleeping giant after another either got stepped upon or kicked. Soon all 9 of them were on their feet, having the most lively free-for-all. They punched and kicked and scratched and beat and battered each other as hard as they could. Blood blowed, noses went crunch, teeth fell out like hailstones. The giant roared and screamed and crushed, and for many minutes the noise of battle rolled across the yellow plain. The BFG smiled, a big wide smile of absolute pleasure. "Is loving it when they're all having a good tough and rumble," he said. "They will kill each other," Sophie said. "Never," the BFG answered. "Those beasts is always pishing and walloping at one another. Soon it will be getting dusky, and they will be galloping off to fill their tummies." "They're coarse and full and filthy," Sophie said. "I hate them." As the BFG headed back to the cave, she said quietly, "We certainly was putting the nightmare to good use enough, wasn't we?" "Excellent use," Sophie said. "Well done, you." Dreams. The big friendly giant was seated at the great table in his cave, and he was doing his homework. Sophie sat cross-legged on the tabletop nearby, watching him at work. The glass jar containing the one and only good dream they had caught that day stood between them. The BFG, with great care and patience, was printing something on a piece of paper with an enormous pencil. "What are you writing?" Sophie asked him. "Every dream is having its special label on the bottle," the BFG said. "How else could I be finding the one I'm waiting in a hurry? But can you really and truly tell what sort of a dream it's going to be simply by listening to it?" Sophie asked. "I can," the BFG said, not looking up. "But how? Is it by the way it hums and buzzes?" "You is less or more right," the BFG said. "Every dream in the world is making a different sort of buzzy hum music, and these grand swashbuckling ears of mine is able to read that music." "By music do you mean tunes?" "It's not meaning tunes. What do you mean?" "Human beings is having their own music, right or left?" "Right," Sophie said. "Lots of music." And sometimes human beings is very overcome when they are hearing wondrous music. They is getting shivers down their spindles. "Right or left?" "Right," Sophie said. "So the music is saying something to them. It is sending a message. I do not think the human beings is knowing what the message is, but they's loving it just the same." "That's about right," Sophie said. "But because of these jump-squiffling ears of mine," the BFG said, "I is not only able to hear the music that dreams is making, but I is understanding it also. What do you mean, understanding it? Sophie said. I can read it. The PFG said. It talks to me. It's like a language. I find that just a little hard to believe, Sophie said. I'll bet you is also finding it hard to believe in Gunwinkles, the PFG said, and how they are visiting us from the stars. Of course I don't believe that, Sophie said. The PFG regarded her gravely with those huge eyes of his. I hope you will forgive me, he said, if I'll tell you what human beings is thinking. There's very clever, but they is not. They is nearly all of them notchimers and squeak peeps. I beg your pardon, Sophie said. The matter with human beings, the PFG went on, that they is absolutely refusing to believe in anything unless they is actually seeing it right in front of their own shanzels. Of course, Gogwinkles is existing. I is meeting them oftenly. I is even chittering to them. He turned away contemptuously from Sophie and resumed his writing. Sophie moved over to read what he had written so far. The letters were printed big and bold, but not very well formed. Is that it said, the dream is about how I is saving my teacher from drowning. I is giving into the river from a high bridge, and I is dragging my teacher to the bank, and then I is giving him this kiss of death. The kiss of what? Sophie asked. The PFG stopped writing and raised his head slowly. His eyes rested on Sophie's face. I is telling you once before, he said quietly, that I is never having a chance to go to school. I is full of mistakes. They is not my fault. I do my best. I is lonely little girl, but please remember that you is not exactly know everything yourself. I'm sorry, Sophie said. I really am. It is very rude of me to keep correcting you. The PFG gazed at her for a while longer, then he bent his head again to his slow, laborious writing. Tell me honestly, Sophie said, if you blew this dream into my bedroom when I was asleep, would I really and truly start dreaming about how I saved my teacher from drowning by diving off the bridge? More, the PFG said, a lot more. But I cannot be scribbling the whole group flunking dream on a teachy bit of paper. Of course there is more. The PFG laid down his pencil and placed on massive ear close to the jar. For about 30 seconds he listened intently. Yes, he said, nodding his great head solemnly up and down. This dream is continuing very nice. It has a very dirty, hunky ending. How does it end? Sophie said. Please tell me. You should be dreaming, the PFG said. That morning, after you saving the teacher from the river, you is arriving at school and you seeing all the 500 pupils sitting in the assembly hall, and all the teachers as well. And the head teacher is then standing up and saying, I is wanting the whole school to give 3 cheers for Sophie because she's so brave and is saving the life. To give 3 cheers if our fine arithmetic teacher, Mr. Vickers, who was unfortunately pushed off the bridge into the river by our gym teacher, Miss Amelia of Scotch. So there, cheers for Sophie! And the whole school is then cheering like mad and shouting bravo, well done, and forever after that, even when you skate in your sumps, all kind of whistled and muggled up, Mr. Figgins is always giving you 10 out of 10 and writing good work, Sophie, in your exercise book. Then you is waking up. I like that dream, Sophie said. Of course you like it, the BFG said. It is a fizz wizard. He licked the back of the label and stuck it into the jar. It is usually written a bit more than on the labels, he said. But you is watching me and making me jumpsy. I'll go and sit somewhere else, Sophie said. Don't go, he said. Look at the jar carefully, and I think you'll be seeing this dream. Sophie peered into the jar, and this, sure enough, shows the faint, translucent outline of something about the size of a hen's egg. There was just a touch of color in it, a pale sea green, soft and shimmering and very beautiful. There it all lay, the small oblong sea green jellyfish thing at the bottom of the jar, quite peaceful, but pulsing gently, the whole of it moving in and out ever so slightly, as though it were breathing. It's moving, Sophie cried. It's alive. Of course it is alive. What will you feed it on? Sophie asked. That's cruel. It's not needing any food. Everything in life needs good food of some sort, even trees and plants. The north wind is alive, the BFG said. It's moving. It touches you on the cheek and on your hands, but nobody is feeding it. Sophie was silent. This extraordinary giant was as sharp in her ideas. He seemed to be leading her towards mysteries that there were beyond her understanding. Her dream is not needing anything, the BFG went on. If it is a good one, it is waiting peaceably forever until it is released and allowed to do its job. If it's a bad one, it is always finding you to get out. The BFG stood up and walked over to one of the many shelves and placed the latest jar among the thousands of others. Please, can I see some of the other dreams? Sophie asked. The BFG hesitated. Nobody's ever seen them before, he said, but perhaps, after all, I's letting you have a little peep. He picked up her off the table and stood her on the palm of one of these huge hands. He carried her towards the shelves. Over there, some of the good dreams, he said. The fizz wizards. Would you hold me closer so I can read the labels? Sophie said. My label is only telling bits of it. Sophie started to read the labels. The first one seemed long enough to her. It went right around the jar, and as she read it, she had to keep turning the jar. That is what it said. Today, I is sitting in glass, and I discover that if I is staring very hard at my teacher in a special way, I is able to put her to sleep. So I keep staring at her and I the fast, and her drops onto the her desk, and she goes fast asleep and snorkes loudly. Then it marches the head teacher, and he shouts, "Wake up, Miss Plumridge! How dare you go to sleep in class? Go fetch your head and coat and leave the school forever. You is sacked." But in a 50 I was put in the hand of teacher to sleep as well, and he just crumpled slowly to the floor like a lump of jelly, and there he lies all its heap and stars, snorkeling even louder than Miss Plumridge. And then I is hearing my mommy's voice saying, "Wake up, your breakfast is ready." "What a funny dream," Sophie said. "It's ring beller," the BFG said. "It's whoopsie." Inside the jar, just below the edge of the label, Sophie could see Pudding to sleep dream, lying peacefully on the bottom, pulsing gently, seagreen like the other one, but perhaps a trifle larger. Inside the jar, just below the edge of the label, Sophie could see the Pudding to sleep dream, lying peacefully on the bottom, pulsing gently, sea-green like the other one, but perhaps a trifle larger. "Do you have separate dreams, for boys or for girls?" Sophie asked. "Of course," the BFG said. "If I is given a girl's dream to a boy, even if it was a really whoopsie girl's dream, the boy would be making up and thinking what a revolting, green-sliding old dreams that was." "Boys would," Sophie said. "This here is all girls' dreams on the shelf," the BFG said. "Can I read a boy's dream?" "You can," the BFG said, and he lifted her to the higher shelf. The label on the nearest boy's dream jar reads as follows: "I is making myself a marvelous pair of session boats, and when I put them on is a label to walk straight up the kitchen wall and across the ceiling. Well, it is walking upside down on the ceiling when my big sister comes in, and she's starting to yell at me, as she always does, yelling what on earth you's doing up there walking on the ceiling, and it looks down at her and smiles. I says, 'I told you you was driving me up the wall, and now you has done it.' 'I find that one rather silly,' Sophie said. 'Boys wouldn't,' the BFG said, grinning. 'It's another ring beller. Perhaps you have seen enough now.' 'Let me read another boy's one,' Sophie said. The next label said, 'The telephone rings in your house, and my father picks it up and says he's a very important telephone voice, Simpkins speaking. This his face goes white and his voice goes all funny, and he says, "What? Who?" And then he says, "Yes, sir, I understand, sir, but surely it is me you's wishing to speak to, sir, not my little son." My father's face is going from white to dark purple, and he is gulping like he has a lobster stuck in his throat, and then at least he is saying, "Yes, sir, very well, sir, I will get him, sir." And he turns to me and he says in a rather respectful voice, "Is you knowing the President of the United States?" And I says, "No, but I expect he's hearing about me." Then I is having a long talk on the phone and saying things like, Let me make care of it, my president. You'll bundle it all if you do it your own way. And my father's eyes is goggling right out of his head, and that's when he's hearing my father's real voice saying, "Get up, you lazy slop, or you'll be late for school." Boys are crazy, Sophie said. Let me read this next one. Sophie started reading the next label. I's having a bath, and I discovering that if I press quite hard on my tummy bottom, a funny feeling comes over me, and I suddenly my legs is not there, nor is my arms. In fact, I has become absolutely invisible all over. I is still there, but no one can see me, not even myself. So my mummy comes, and I says, "Where is that child? He is in the bath, I mean to go, and he can't possibly have washed himself properly." So I says, "Here it is." And she says, "Where?" And I says, "Here." And he says, "Where?" And I says, "Here." And she yells, "Henry, come up quick." And then my daddy rushes, and I is washing myself, and my daddy sees the soap floating around in the air, but of course he is not seeing me, and he shouts, "Where are you, boy?" And I says, "Here." And he says, "Where?" And I says, "Here." And he says, "Where?" And he says, "The soap, boy, the soap. It's flying in the air." Then I press my tummy button again, and now I is visible. My daddy is squealing with excitement, and he says, "You is the invisible boy." And I says, "Now I is going to have some fun." So then I is out of the bath, and I have breathed myself. I put on my dressing gown and I slippers, and I press my tummy button again to become invisible. And I go down into the town and walk in the streets. Of course, only me is invisible, but not the things I is wearing. So when people is seeing a dressing gown and slippers floating along the street with nobody in is there, in a panic with everybody yelling. And he lets out a fright-storm howl and dashes back into the pub. And then I is waking up and feeling happy as a whisk-quilter. "Pretty ridiculous," Sophie said. All the same, she couldn't resist reaching down and pressing her own tummy button to see if it worked. Nothing happened. "Dreams is very mystical things," the BFG said. "Human beings is not understanding them at all. Not even their brainiest professors is understanding them. Have you seen enough?" "Just this last one," Sophie said. "This one here," she started reading. "I has written a book, and it is so exciting, nobody can put it down. As soon as you has read the first line, you is so hooked on it you cannot stop until the last page. In all the cities, people is walking in the streets, bumping into each other because their faces is buried in my book. And dentist is reading and trying to feel teeth at the same time, but nobody minds because they is all reading into in the dentist chair. Drivers is reading it while driving, and cars is crashing all the country. Brain surgeon is reading it while they is operating on brains, and airline pilots is reading it and going to Timbuktu instead of London. Football players is reading it on the field because they can't put it down, and so it's Olympic runners while they's running. Everybody has to see what is going to happen next in my book, and then I wake up, I still tingling with excitement and being at the greatest reader the world has ever known, until my mommy comes in and says, I was looking at your English exercise book last night, and really your sleeping is trash, so is your punt lesson. That's enough for now, the BFG said. There is dalliance more, but my arm is getting tired of holding you up. What all is those over there? Sophie said. Why have they got such tiny labels? That, the BFG said, it's because one day I is catching so many dreams, I is not having the time or energy to write out long labels. But there is enough to remind me. Can I look? Sophie said. The long-suffering BFG carried her across the jars she was pointing to. Sophie read them rapidly, after the other. I is climbing Mount Everest with my pussycat for company. I is inventing a car that runs on toothpaste. I is able to make the electric lights go on and up just by wishing it. I is only an 8-year-old little boy, but I is growing a splendid bushy beard, and all the other boys is jealous. I is able to jump out of any high window and float down safely. I has a pet bee that makes rock and roll music, then it flies. What amazes me, Sophie said, is how you ever learned to write in the first place. Oh, said the BFG, I has been wondering how long is it before you is asking me that. Considering you never went to school, I think it's quite marvelous. Sophie said, how did you learn? The BFG crossed the cave and opened a tiny secret door in the wall. He took out a loop, very old and tattered. But human standards, it was an ordinary size book, but it looked like a postage stamp in his huge hand. One night, he said, I is blowing a dream through a window, and I sees this book lying on the little boy's bedroom table. I wanted it so very badly, you understand, but I is refusing to steal it. I would never do that. So how did you get it? Sophie asked. I borrowed it. The BFG said, smiling a little. Just for a short time I borrowed it. How long have you had it? Sophie asked. Perhaps only about 80 years, the BFG said. And that's how you taught yourself to write? Sophie asked him. I was reading it hundreds of times, the BFG said. I was still reading it and teaching new words to myself and how to write them. I is the most delicious story. Sophie took the book out of his hand. Nicholas Nickleby, she read aloud. By Charles Jenkins, the BFG said. By who? Just when she came a tremendous noise of gallowing. Feet above from outside the cave. What's that? Sophie cried. That is all the giants zip-feeding off the other country to guzzle human beings. The BFG said. He quickly popped Sophie into his waistcoat pocket, then hurried to the cave entrance and rolled back the stone. Sophie, peeping out on her spy hole, saw all 9 of the fearsome giants coming past at full gallop. "Where is Yerf tonight?" shouted the BFG. "We's all of us flash bunking off to England tonight," answered the flesh pump eater as they went galloping past. "England is a lecture's land, and we's fancying a few nice little English chidlers," I shouted the maid masher. "Is knowing where there's giggle house for girls, and I gizzling myself full of fruit blower, and I knows where there are puggle box for boys," shouted the jazzard glopper. "All I has to do is search in and grab myself a handful." English boys is tasting extra liquishy. In a few seconds, the 9 galloping giants were out of sight. "What did he mean?" Sophie said, poking his head out of the pocket. "What is jiggle house for girls?" "He's meaning a girl's school," the BFG said. "He will be eating them by bundle." "Oh no!" cried Sophie. "And boys from a boys' school," said the BFG. "It mustn't happen!" Sophie cried out. "We've got to stop them. We can't just sit here and do nothing." "There's not a thing we can do," said the BFG. "We is helpless as horse feathers." He sat down on a large, craggy blue rock near the entrance to his cave. He took Sophie from his pocket and pulled her beside him on the rock. "It is now quite safe for you to be outside until they is coming back," he said. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and it was getting dark. "The great plan. We've absolutely got to stop them," Sophie cried. "Put me back in your pocket, quick, and we'll chase after them and warn everybody in England they're coming." "Ridiculous and impossible," the BFG said. "They is going 2 times as fast as me, and there is fish in their guzzle before he's halfway." "But we can't just sit here doing nothing," Sophie cried. "How many girls and boys are they going to eat tonight?" "Many," the BFG said. "The flesh lump eating giant alone has a most squattling whoopsie appetite. Will he snatch them out of their beds while they're sleeping, like peas out of the puddle?" the BFG said. "I can't bear to think of it," Sophie cried. "Then don't," the BFG said. "For years and years I is sitting here on this very rock every night after night, then they is galloping away, and I is feeling so sad for that all the human beings they is going to gobble up. But I has to get used to it. There is nothing I can do. If I wasn't a teachy little runty giant only 24 feet high, then I would be stopping them. But that it is absolutely out of the window." "Do you always know where they are going?" Sophie asked. "Always," the BFG said. "Every night they is yelling at me as they go plodding past. The other day they was yelling we's off to Mississippi and Missouri to guzzle them both." "Disgusting," Sophie said. "I hate them." She and the big friendly giant sat quietly side by side on the blue rock in the garden in dusk. Sophie had never felt so helpless in her life. After a while, she stood up and cried out, "I can't stand it. Just think of those poor girls and boys who are going to be eaten alive in a few hours. We can't just sit here and do nothing. We've got to go after those brutes." "No," the BFG said. "We must," Sophie cried. "Why don't you go?" The BFG sighed and shook his head firmly. "I has told you 5 or 6 times," he said, "and the third will be the last. I's never showing myself to human beings." "Why ever not?" "If I do, they will be putting me in the zoo with all the stuff." "Nonsense," Sophie said, "and they will be sending you straight to an orphanage," the BFG went on. "Grown-up human beings is not famous for their kindnesses. There's all squirrel floaters and green sludgers." "That simply is not true," Sophie cried angrily. "Some of them are very kind indeed." "Who?" the BFG said. "Name one." "The Queen of England," Sophie said. "You can't call her—" "Well," the BFG said, "you can't call her a squeak squeak or a nutmudger either," Sophie said, getting angrier and angrier. "The flash lampeter is longing dearly to guzzle her up," the BFG said, smiling a little now. "Who's the Queen?" Sophie cried aghast. "Yes," the BFG answered. "Flash lampeter says he's never eaten a queen, and he thinks perhaps she's had an especially nice flavor." "How dare he?" Sophie cried. "But Flash lampeter says there is too many soldiers around her palace, and he daresn't try it." "He'd better not," Sophie said. "He's also saying he would like very much to guzzle one of the soldiers in his pretty red suit, but he is worried about those big black fury hats they's wearing. He thinks they must be sticking in his throat. I hopes he chokes," Sophie said. "Flash lampeter is a very careful giant," the BFG said. Sophie was silent for a few moments. Then suddenly, in a voice filled with excitement, she cried out, "I've got it! By golly, I think I've got it!" "Got what?" asked the BFG. "The answer," cried Sophie. "We'll go to the Queen. It's a terrific idea. If I went and told the Queen about those disgusting men eating giants, I'm sure he'd do something about it." The BFG looked down at her sadly and shook his head. "She's never believing you," he said. "Never in a month of Mondays." "I think she would." "Never," the BFG said. "It is sounding such a wonky tall story. The Queen will be laughing and saying, 'What an awful rubsquash.'" "She would not." "Of course she would," the BFG said. "I has told you before the human beings. He's simply not believing in giants." "Then it's up to us to find a way of making her believe in them," Sophie said. "And now is you getting in to see the Queen anyway?" the BFG asked. "Now, hold on a sec," Sophie said. "Just you hold a sec before I've got another idea." "Your ideas are full of grotworgle," the BFG said. "Not is not one," Sophie said. "You say that if we will tell the Queen, she would never believe us." "It is certain she wouldn't," the BFG said. "But we aren't going to tell her," Sophie said exactly. We don't have to tell her. We'll make it her dream it. That is an ever more front-bungling suggestion, the BFG said. Dreams is lots of fun, but nobody is believing in dreams either. You is only believing in a dream while you is actually dreaming it. But as soon as you is waking up, you're saying, "Oh, thank goodness it was only a dream." Don't worry about that part of it, Sophie said. I can fix it. Never can you fix it, the BFG said. I can, I swear I can, but first of all, let me ask you a very important question. Here it is. Can you make a person dream absolutely anything in the world? Anything you like, the BFG said profoundly. If I said I wanted to dream that I was in a flying bathtub with silver wings, could you make me dream it? I could, the BFG said. But how? Sophie said. You obviously don't have exactly that dream in your collection. I do not, the BFG said, but I could soon be mixing it up. How could you mix it up? It is a little bit like mixing a cake, the BFG said. You just put in the right amounts of all the different things into it. You is making the cake some out any way you want, sugary, spongy, currantly, Christmassy or glob switchy, if it is the same with dreams. Go on, Sophie said. I has Dylan's of dreams on my shelves, right or left? Right, Sophie said. I has dreams about bathtubs, lots of them. I had dreams about silver wings. I has dreams about flying, so all I has to do is mix those dreams together in the proper way, and I's very quickly making a dream where you's flying in a bathtub with silver wings. I see what you mean, Sophie said, but I didn't know you could mix one dream with another. Dreams like being mixed, the BFG answered. They's getting very lonesome all by themselves in those glassy bottles. Right, Sophie said. Now then, do you have dreams about the Queen of England? Lots of them, the BFG said. And about giants? Of course, the BFG said. And about giants eating people? Swiggles of them, the BFG said. And what about little girls like me? And you could mix them all up just as I want to do, Sophie asked, getting more and more excited. Of course, the BFG said, but how is just helping us? I think you's barking up the wrong dog. Now hold on, Sophie said. Listen carefully. I want you to mix a dream which you will blow into the Queen of England's bedroom when she is asleep, and this is how it will go. Now hang on a minute, the BFG said. How's I possibly going to go near enough to the Queen of England bedroom to blow in my dream? You taking dumplessly? I'll tell you that later, Sophie said. For the moment, please listen carefully. Here is the dream I want you to mix. Are you paying attention? Very close, the BFG said. I want the Queen to dream that 9 disgusting giants, each one about 50 feet tall, are galloping to England in the night. She must dream their names as well. What are the names again? Flesh Lampeter, the BFG said. Manger, Bone Cruncher, Grill Chewer, meat draper, gizzard gulper, maid masher, blood butler, and butcher boy. Let her dream all those names, Sophie said, and let her dream that they will be creeping into England in the depths of the witching hour, and snatching little boys and girls from their bed. Let her dream that they will be reaching into the bedroom without and pulling these little boys and girls out of their beds, and then, Sophie paused. Do they eat them on the spot, or do they carry them away first? She asked. They's usually just popping them straight into their mouths, like popcorn, the BFG said. Put that in a dream, Sophie said, and then the dream must say that when their tummies are full, they will go galloping back to giant country where no one can find them. Is that all? The BFG said. Certainly not, Sophie said. You must then explain to the queen in her dream that there is a big friendly giant who can tell her where all those beasts are living, so that she can send her soldiers and her armies to capture them at once for all. And now let her dream one last and very important thing. Let her dream that there is a little girl called Sophie sitting on her window sill who will tell her where the big friendly giant is hiding. Where he is hiding? Asked the BFG. We'll come to that later, Sophie said. So the queen dreams her dream right. The BFG said. Then she wakes up, and first thing she's thinking is what a horrid dream. I'm so glad it was only a dream. Then she looks up from her pillow, and what does she see? What does she see? The BFG asked. She sees a little girl called Sophie sitting on her windowsill right there in real life before her very eyes. How is he going to be sitting on the queen's windowsill? May I beg? The BFG said. You are going to put me there, Sophie said, and that's the lovely part about it. If someone dreams that there is a little girl sitting on her windowsill and man, she wakes up and sees that the little girl really sitting here, that is a dream come true, it is not? I is beginning to see where you is driving to, the BFG said. If the queen is knowing that part of her dream is true, then perhaps she is believing the rest of it's true as well. That's about it, Sophie said, but I shall to have convinced her of that myself. You said you is wanting to dream to say there is a big friendly giant. He is also going to talk to the queen. Absolutely, Sophie said. You must. You are the only one of who can tell her where to find the other giants. How is I meeting the queen? Asked the BFG. I is not wanting to be shooted at by her soldiers. The soldiers are only in front of the palace, Sophie said, and the back there is a huge garden, and there are no soldiers in there at all. There is a very high wall with spikes in and around the garden to stop people climbing it, but you can simply walk over that. How is you knowing all this about the Queen Palace? The BFG asked. Last year I was in a different orphanage, Sophie said. It was in London, and we used to go for walks all around there. Is you helping me to find this palace? the BFG asked. I has never dared to go hide and sneaking around London in my life. Don't be, Sophie said. It's full of tiny dark streets and there are very few people about in a witching hour. The BFG picked up Sophie up between a finger and a thumb and placed her gently on the palm on the other hand. Is there a queen's palace very big? He asked. Huge, Sophie said. Then how is we finding the right bedroom? That is up to you, Sophie said. You are supposed to be an expert at that sort of thing. And he was absolutely sure the queen will not put me in a zoo with all the caterpillars. Of course she won't, Sophie said. You'll be here, a hero, and you'll never have to eat cumbers again. Sophie saw the BFG eyes widen. He licked her lips. You mean it? He said. You really mean it? No more disgusting cumbers. You couldn't get one of you if you wanted to, Sophie said. Humans don't grow them. That did it. The BFG got to his feet. Then, is you wanting me to mix the special dreams? He asked. Now, Sophie said, at once. When is we going to see the queen? He said. Tonight, Sophie said, as soon as you mix the dream. Tonight? The BFG cried. Why such a flesh pumpkin furry? If we can't save tonight, children, we can't anyway summon tomorrow's, Sophie said. What is more, I'm getting famished. I haven't had a thing to eat for 24 hours. Then we had better get cracking, the BFG said, moving back towards the cave. Sophie kissed him onto the tip of his thumb. I knew you'd do it, she said. Come on, let's hurry. Mixing the dreams. It was dark now. The night had already begun. The BFG, with Sophie sitting on his hand, hurried into the cave and put on those brilliant blinding lights that seemed to come from nowhere. He placed Sophie on the table. Stay there, please, he said, and no tittering. Eyes needing to listen only to silence when I is mixing up such a naughty, plexicated dreams as this. He hurried away from her. He got out an enormous empty glass jar that was the size of a washing machine. He couched into his chest and hurried towards the shelves on which stood the thousands and thousands of smaller jars containing the captured dreams. Dreams about giants, he muttered to himself as he reached the labels. The giant is causing human beings. No, not that one. Nor that one. Here's one. And here's another. He grabbed the jars and unscrewed the tops. He typed the dreams into the enormous jar. He was clutching, and as each other one went in, Sophie caught a glimpse of a small sea green blob tumbling from one jar to the other. The BFG hurried towards another shelf. Now he muttered, I is wanting this dream about jiggle houses for girls and about puzzle boxes for boys. He was becoming very tense now. Sophie could almost see the excitement bubbling inside him as he scurried back and forth among his below jars. There must have been 50,000 dreams altogether up there on the shelves, but he seemed to know almost exactly where every one of them was. Dreams about a little girl, he muttered. And dreams about me, about the BFG. Come on, hurry up, get on with. Now there is a wonky world as I keep in those. And so it went on. In about half an hour, the BFG had found all the dreams he wanted and had typed them into the one huge jar. He put the jar on the table. Sophie sat watching him, but he said nothing. Inside the big jar, lying on the bottom of it, she could clearly see about 50 of those oval sea green jellyfish shapes, all pushing gently in and out, some lying on top of others, but each one still a quite separate individual dream. Now is mixing dream, the BFG announced, and went to the cupboard where he kept his bottles of Frobscottle, and from it he took out a gigantic egg beater. It's one of those that has a handle which you turn. And down below there are a lot of overlapping blades that go whistling round. He inserted the bottom end of this contraption into the big jar where the dreams were lying. Watch, he said. He started turning the handle very fast. Flashes of green and blue exploded inside the jar. The dreams were being whisked into a sea green mouse. The poor things, Sophie cried. They is not feeling it, the BFG said as they turned the handle. Dreams is not like human beings or animals. They has no brains. They is made of zooms. After about a minute, the BFG stopped whisking. The whole bottle was now full of the brim with the large bubbles. They were almost exactly like the bubbles we ourselves blow from soapy water, except that these had ever brighter and more beautiful colors swimming on their surfaces. Keep watching, the BFG said. Quite slowly, the Tomba's bubbler rose up through the neck on the jar and floated away. A second one followed, then a third and fourth. Soon the cave was filled with hundreds of beautifully colored bubbles, all drifting gently through the air. It was truly a wonderful sight. As Sophie watched them, they all started floating towards the cave entrance, which was still open. They're going out, Sophie whispered. Of course, the BFG said. Where to? Those is all little tiny dream bits that isn't using, the BFG said. They's going to back to the misty country to join up with proper dreams. It's all a bit beyond me, Sophie said. Dreams is full of mystery and magic, the BFG said. Don't try to understand them. Look in the big bottle and you will now see the dream you is wanting for the queen. Sophie turned and stared into the great jar. On the bottom of it, something was thrashing around wildly, bouncing up and down and flinging itself against the walls of the jar. "Good heavens!" she cried. "Is that it?" "That's," the BFG said proudly. "But it's horrible," Sophie cried. "In jumping about, it wants to get out." "That is because it's a troglometer," the BFG said. "It's a nightmare." "Oh, but I don't want to give the Queen a nightmare," Sophie cried. "If she's dreaming about giants guzzling up little boys and girls, then what is she expecting it to be except a nightmare?" the BFG said. "Oh no!" Sophie cried. "Oh yes," the BFG said. "A dream where you see little children being eaten is about the most frightsome troglometing dream you can get. It is a grisly dog thumper. It's a whoopsie crop witcher. It's all of them riddled into one. It is a bad as dream I blew into the flesh on Peter this afternoon. Is it worse?" Sophie stared down at the fearful nightmare dream that was still thrashing away in the huge glass jar. It was much larger than the others. It was about the size and shape of, shall we say, a turkey egg. It was jellyfish. It had tingles of bright scarlet deep inside it. There was something terrible about the mate was throwing itself against the sides of the jar. "I don't want to give the Queen a nightmare," Sophie said. "I's thinking," the BFG said, "that your Queen will be happy to have a nightmare if having a nightmare is going to save a lot of human beings from being gobbled up by fearsome giants. Is I right or is I left?" "I suppose you're right," Sophie said. "It's good to be done." "She will be soon be getting over it," the BFG said. "Have you put all the other important things into it?" Sophie asked. "When I was blowing the dream into the Queen's bedroom," the BFG said, "she will be dreaming every single little thing Galling is asking me to make her dream. About me sitting on the window sill, that part is very strong. And about a big friendly giant, I is putting a nice long carpet about him," the BFG said. As he spoke, he picked up one of the smaller jars and very quickly typed the struggling thrashing troglometer out of the large jar into the small one. Then he screwed the lid tightly in onto the small jar. "That's it," he announced. "He's now ready." He fetched his suitcase and pulled the small jar into it. "Why bother to take a great big suitcase when you have only got one jar?" Sophie said. "You could put the jar in your pocket." The BFG looked down at her and smiled. "By goggles," he said, taking a jar out of the suitcase. "Your head is not quite so full of cream sludge after all. I can see you'd no born last week." "Thank you, kind sir," Sophie said, making a little curtsy from the tabletop. "Is you ready to leave?" the BFG asked. "I'm ready," Sophie cried. Her heart was beginning to thump at all the thoughts of that they were about to do. It really was a wild and crazy thing. Perhaps they would both be thrown in prison. The BFG was putting on his great black cloak. He tucked the jar into a pocket on his cloak. He picked up his long trumpet like dream blower. Then he turned and looked at Sophie, who was still on the tabletop. "The dream bottle is in my pocket," he said. "Is you going to sit in there with it during the travel?" "Never," cried Sophie. "I refuse to sit next to that beastly thing." "Then where is you going to sit?" the BFG asked her. Sophie looked him over for a few moments. Then she said, "If you would be kind enough to swivel one of your lovely big urns so that is flying like a dish, that would make a very cozy place for me to sit." "By Gulmo, that is quite a good idea," the BFG said. Slowly, she swelled his huge right ear until it was like a great shelf facing the heavens. He lifted Sophie up and placed her into it. The ear itself, which was about the size of a large tea tray, was full of the same channels and crinkles as a human ear. It was extremely comfortable. "I hope I don't fall down your ear hole," Sophie said, edging away from the large hole just beside her. "Be very careful not to do that," the BFG said. "You would be giving me a croaking earache." The nice thing about being there was that she could whisper directly into his ear. "You is tickling me a bit," the BFG said. "Please do not jiggle about." "I'll try not to," Sophie said. "Are we ready?" "Wee!" yelled the BFG. "Don't do that." "I didn't do anything," Sophie said. "You is talking too loud. You is forgetting the I is hearing very little thing-a-licking 50 times louder than usual, and you there is you shouting away right inside my ear." "Oh gosh," Sophie mumbled, "I forgot that. Your voice is sounding like thunder and trumpets." "I'm so sorry," Sophie whispered. "Is that better?" "No," cried the BFG. "It sounds as though you is shooting off pontonballs." "Then how can I talk to you?" Sophie whispered. "Don't," cried the poor BFG. "Please don't. Each word is like you is dropping buzz bombs in my ear hole." Sophie tried speaking right under the breath. "Is this better?" she said. She spoke so softly she couldn't ever hear her own voice. "That's better," the BFG said. "Now I is hearing you very nicely. What is it you do trying to say to me just now?" "I was saying, are you ready?" "Way is off," cried the BFG, heading for the cave entrance. "Well off to meet Her Majesty the Queen." Outside the cave, he rolled the large round stone back into the place and set off a tremendous gallop. Journey to London. The great yellow wasteland lay dim and milky in the moonlight as the big friend giant went galloping across it. Sophie, still wearing only her nightie, was reclining comfortably in the service of the BFG right ear. She was actually in the outer rim of the ear. made near the top, where the edge of the ear folds over, and this folding over bit made a sort of a roof for her and gave her wonderful protection against the rushing wind. That sumptuous lying on skin that was soft and warm and almost velvety. Nobody, she told herself, had ever travelled in greater comfort. Sophie peeped over the rim of the ear and watched the desolate landscape of giant country go whizzing by. They were certainly moving fast. The BFG went on bouncing off the ground as though there were rockets in his toes, and each stride he took lifted him about 100 feet into the air. But he had not yet gone into what whistling top gear of his, when die round became blurred by speed, and the wind howled, and his feet didn't seem to be touching anything but air. That would come later. Sophie had not slept for a long time. She was very tired. She was also warm and comfortable. She dozed off. She didn't know how long she slept, but when she woke up again and looked out over the edge of the fair, the landscape had changed completely. There were green country now, with mountains and forest. It was still dark, but the moon was shining as brightly as ever. Suddenly, and without slowing his pace, the BFG turned his head sharply to the left. For the first time during the entire journey, he spoke a few words. "Look, quick, over there," he said, pounding his long trumpet. Sophie looked in the direction he was pointing. Through the murky darkness, as they saw us first, was a great cloud of dust about 300 yards away. Those in the other giants all galloping back home after their castle, the BFG said. Then Sophie saw them. In the light of the moon, she saw 9 all of those monsters, half-naked brutes, thundering across the landscape together. They were galloping in a pack, their necks craned forward, their arms bent at the elbows, and worst of all, their stomachs bulging. The strides, they were incredible. Their speed was unbelievable. Their feet pounded and thundered off the ground and fell the great sheets of dust behind them. But in 10 seconds they were gone. A lot of little girls' and boys' is no longer sleeping in their beds tonight, the BFG said. Sophie felt quite ill, but this grim encounter made her sound than ever determined to go through with her mission. I must have been about an hour or so later than the BFG began to slow his pace. "We're in England now," he said suddenly. Dark though it was, Sophie could see that they were in a country of green fields with neat hedges in between the fields. There were hills with trees all over them, and occasionally there were roads with the lights of cars moving along. Each time they came to a road, the BFG was over it and away, and no motorist could possibly have anything except a quick black shadow flashing overhead. All at once, a curious orange-colored glow appeared in the sky ahead of them. "We's coming close to London," the BFG said. He slowed to a trot. He began looking about cautiously. Groups of horses were now appearing on all the sides, but there was still no light in their windows. It was too early for anyone to be getting up yet. "Someone bound to see us," Sophie said. "Never is they seeing me," the BFG said confidently. "You's forgetting that I's doing this sort of thing for years and years and years. No human being is ever catching ever the smallest wink of me." "I did," Sophie whispered. "Ah," he said, "yes, but you was the very first." During the next half-hour, sleep moved so swiftly and so silently that Sophie, crouching in the giant's ear, was unable to understand exactly what was going on. They were in the streets. There were houses everywhere. Sometimes there were shops. There were bright lamps in the streets. There were quite few people about, and there were cars with lights on, but nobody noticed the BFG. It was impossible to understand quite how he did. There was a kind of magic in his movements. He seemed to melt into a moving. He would glide noiselessly from one dark place to another, always moving, always gliding forward through the street of London, his black cloak blending with the shadows of the night. It is quite possible that one or two late-night wanderers might have been through. They saw a tall black shadow skimming swiftly down a murky side street. But even if they had, they would have never believed their own eyes. They would have dismissed it's all an illusion and blamed themselves for seeing things that weren't there. Sophie and the BFG came at last to a large place full of trees. There was a road running through it and a lake. There were no people in this place, and the BFG stopped for the first time since they had yet set out from its cave many hours before. "What's the matter?" Sophie whispered in her under-the-breath voice. "Ice isn't a bit of puddle," he said. "You are going marvelously," Sophie whispered. "No, I isn't," he said. "I's now completely boggled. I's lost. But why?" "Because we's meant to be in the middle of London, and suddenly we's in a green pastures." "Don't be silly," Sophie whispered. "This is the middle of London. It's called Hyde Park. I know exactly where we are." He was joking. "I'm not. I swear I'm not. We're almost there." "You mean we is nearly at the Queen's Palace?" cried the BFG. "It's just across the road," Sophie whispered. "This is where I take over." "Which way?" the BFG asked. "Straight ahead." The BFG trotted forward through the deserted park. "Now stop." The BFG stopped. "You see that huge round table ahead of us just outside the park?" Sophie whispered. "Yes, I see it." "That is Hyde Park Corner." Even now, when it was still an hour before dawn, there was quite a lot of traffic moving around Hyde Park Corner. Then Sophie whispered, "In the middle of the round abode, there was an enormous stone arch with a statue of a horse and a rider on top of it. Can you see that? The BFG peered through the street. I seen it, he said. Do you think that if you took a very fast run at it, could you jump clean over the high park corner, over the arch, and over the horse and rider and land the pavement the other side? Easy, the BFG said. You are sure? You're absolutely sure? I promise, the BFG said. Whatever you do, you mustn't land in the middle of Hyde Park Corner. Don't get so lost, the BFG said to me. That is a snitchy little jump. There is no thing going to do it. Then go, Sophie whispered. The BFG broke into full gallop. He went crouching across the park, and just before he reached the rail lights that divided it from the streets, he took it off. It was a gigantic leap. He flew high over the Hyde Park corner and landed as softly as a cat on the pavement of the other side. Well done, Sophie whispered. How quick! Over that wall, directly in front of them, bordering the pavement, there was a brick wall with fearsome-looking spikes all along the top of it. A swift crouch, a little leap, and the BFG was over it. We're there, Sophie whispered excitedly. We are in the Queen's back garden. The palace. By gumdrops, whispered the big friendly giant. Is that really it? There is the palace, Sophie whispered back. No more than 100 yards away, through tall trees in the garden, across the mown lawns of the tidy flower beds, the massive shaped garden of the palace itself loomed through the darkness. It was made of whitish stone. The sheer sides of it stretched the BFG. But this palace is having 100 bedrooms at least, he said. Easily, I shouldn't think, Sophie whispered. Then eyes boggled. The BFG said, How is I possibly finding the one there the Queen is sleeping? Let's go a bit closer and have a look, Sophie whispered. The BFG glided forward among the trees. Suddenly, he stopped dead. The great ear in which Sophie was sitting began to spiral around. Hey, Sophie whispered, you're going to tip me out. Shh, the BFG whispered back. I's hearing something. He stopped behind a clump of bushes. He waited. The ear was still swinging this way and that. Sophie had to hang on tight to the side of it to save herself from tumbling out. The BFG pointed through a gap in the bushes, and there, no more than 50 yards away, she saw a man padding softly across the lawn. He had a guard dog with him on a leash. The BFG stayed as still as a stone. So did Sophie. The man and the dog walked on and disappeared into the darkness. You was telling me there has no soldiers in the garden, the BFG whispered. He wasn't a soldier, Sophie whispered. He was some sort of a watchman. He'll have to be careful. It is not to worry, the BFG said. These wacky big ears of mine, he's picking up even the noise of a man breathing the other side of this garden. How much longer before it begins to get light? Soapy whispered. Very short, the BFG said. We must go pell-mell for leather now. He glided forward through the vast garden, and once again Sophie noticed how he seemed to melt into the shadows wherever he went. His feet made no sound at all, even when he was walking on gravel. Suddenly they were ripped up close against the back wall of the great palace. The BFG's head was level with the upper windows on the flight up, and Sophie, sitting in its ear, had the same view. In all the windows on that floor the curtains seemed to be drawn. There were no lights showing anywhere. In the distance they could hear the muttering sound of traffic going round Hyde Park Corner. The BFG stopped and put the other ear, the one Sophie wasn't sitting in, close to the first window. No, he whispered. What are you listening to? Sophie whispered back. For breathing, the BFG whispered. I is able to tell if it's a man, human being, or a lady by a breathing voice. He has a man in tree, snorting a little bit too. He glided on, flattering his tall, thin black-cloaked body against the side of the building. He came to the next window. He listened. No, he whispered. He moved on. This room is empty, he whispered. He listened in the several more windows, but each one of them he shook his head and moved on. Then he came to a window in the very center of the palace. He listened but did not move on. Ho, ho, he whispered. We has a lady sleeping in there. Sophie felt a little quiver go running down her spine. But who? She whispered back. The BFG put a finger to his lips for silence. He reached up through the open window and parted the curtains ever so slightly. The orange glow from the night sky over London crept into the room and cast a glimmer of light onto its walls. It was a large room, a lovely room, a rich carpet, glitter chairs, a dressing table, a bed, and on the pillow on the bed lay the head of a sleeping woman. Sophie suddenly found herself looking at the face she had seen on stamps and coins in the newspapers all her life. For a few seconds she was speechless. Is that her? The BFG whispered. Yes, Sophie whispered back. The BFG wasted no time. First, very carefully, he started to raise the lower half of the large window. The BFG was an expert on windows. He had opened thousands of them over the years to blow his dreams into children's bedrooms. Some windows got stuck, some were wobbly, some creaked. He was pleased to find that the Queen's window slid upward like silk. He pushed up the lower half as far as it would go, so as to leave a place on the sill for Sophie to sit. Next, he closed the crack in the curtains. Then, with finger and thumb, He lifted Sophie out of his ear and placed her on the window ledge, with her legs dangling just inside the room, but behind the curtains. "Now don't you go toppling backwards," the BFG whispered. "You must always be holding on tight with both hands to the inside of the window sill." Sophie did as she said. It was summertime in London, and the night was not cold, but don't forget that Sophie was wearing only her thin nightie. She would give anything for a dress and gown, not just to keep her warm, but to hide the witnesses on her auntie from watchful eyes in the garden below. The BFG was taking the glass jar from the pocket on his cloak. He unscrewed the lid. Now, very cautiously, he poured the precious dream into the wide end of his trumpet. He steered the trumpet through the gardens far in the room, aiming at in the lace plate he knew the bed to be. He took a deep breath. He puffed out his cheeks, and poof, he blew. Now he was withdrawing the trumpet, sliding it out very, very carefully, like a thermometer. "You is all right sitting there?" he whispered. "Yes," Sophie murmured. She was quite terrified, but determined not to show it. She looked down over her shoulder. The ground seemed miles away. It was a nasty drop. "How long will the dream take to work?" Sophie whispered. "Some takes an hour," the BFG whispered back. "Some is quicker, some is slower still, but I is sure to find her in the end." Sophie said nothing. "I is going off to wait in the garden," the BFG whispered. "When you is waiting to me, just call out my name, and I is coming very quick. Will you hear me?" Sophie whispered. "He is forgetting this," the BFG whispered, smiling and pointing to his great eyes. "Goodbye," Sophie whispered. Suddenly, unexpectedly, the BFG leaned forward and kissed her gently on the cheek. Sophie felt like crying. When she turned to look at him, he was already gone. He had simply melted away into the dark garden. The Queen. Dawn came at last, and the rim of a melon-colored sun rose up behind the rooftop somewhere behind Victoria Station. A while later, Sophie felt a little of its warmth on her back and was grateful. In the distance, she heard a church clock striking. She counted the strikes. There was 7. She found it almost impossible to believe that she, Sophie, a little orphan of no real importance in the world, was at this moment actually sitting high above the ground on the window sill for the Queen of England's bedroom, with the Queen herself asleep in there behind the curtain, not more than 5 yards away. The very idea of it was absurd. No one had ever done such a thing before. It was a terrifying thing to be doing. What would happen if the dream didn't work? No one, least of all the Queen, would believe a word of her story. It seemed possible that nobody had even woken up to find a small child sitting behind the curtains on his and her windowsill. The Queen was bound to get a shock. Who wouldn't? With all the patience of a small girl who has something important to wait for, Sophie sat motionless on the windowsill. How much longer? She wondered. What time do queens wake up? Faint stirrings and distant sounds came to her from deep inside the belly of the palace. Then all at once, beyond the curtains, she heard the voice of the sleeper in the bedroom. It was a slightly blurred sleep talker's voice. "Oh no," it cried out. "No, no, don't someone stop them. Don't let them do it. I can't bear it. Oh, please stop them. It's horrible. Oh, it's ghastly. No, no, no." She is having the dream, Sophie told herself. It must be really horrid. It felt so sorry for her, but it was to be done. After that, there were few moans. There were long silence. Sophie waited. She looked over her shoulder. She was terrified that she would see the man with a dog down in the garden staring up at her. But the garden was deserted. A pale summer mist hung over in like smoke. It was an enormous garden, very beautiful, with a large funny-shaped lake at the far end. There was an island in the lake, and there were ducks swimming on the water. Inside the room, beyond the curtains, Sophie suddenly heard what was obviously a knock on the door. She heard the door knob being turned. She heard someone entering the room. "Good morning, Your Majesty," a woman was saying. It was the voice of an oldish person. There was a pause and then a slight rattle of china and silver. "Will you have to stray on the bed, ma'am, or on the table?" "Oh, Mary, something awful has just happened." This was a voice Sophie had heard many times on radio and television, especially on Christmas Day. It was a very well-known voice. "Whatever is it, ma'am?" "I've just had the most frightful dream. It was a nightmare. It was awful." "Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am, but don't be distressed. You're awake now, and it will go away. It was only a dream, man." "Do you know what I dreamed, Mary?" "I dreamed that girls and boys were being snatched out of their beds at boarding school and were being eaten by the most ghastly giants. The giants were putting their arms in through the dormitory windows and plucking the children out with their fingers. One lot from a girls' school and another from boys' school. It was so vivid, Mary. It was so real." There was a silence. Sophie waited. She was squirming with excitement. But why the silence? Why didn't the other one, the maid, why didn't she say something? "What's on earth the matter, Mary?" the famous voice was saying. There was another silence. "Mary, you've gone as white as a sheet. Are you feeling ill?" There was suddenly a crash and clatter of croaky which could only have meant that the tray the maid was carrying had fallen out of her hands. "Mary," the famous voice was saying rather sharply, "I think you'd better sit down at once. You look as though you are going to faint. You really mustn't take it so hard just because I've had an awful dream." That isn't the reason, ma'am." The maid's voice was quivering terribly. "Then what's heaven's sake, what is the reason?" "I'm very sorry about the tray, ma'am." "Oh, don't worry about the tray. But what on earth, what has made you drop it? Why did you go wild and gosh off all sudden? You haven't seen the papers yet, have you, ma'am?" "No, what do they say?" Sophie heard the rustling of a newspaper as it was being handed over. "It's like a very dream you had in the night, ma'am." "Rubbish, Mary. Where is it?" "On the front page, ma'am. It is in the headlines." "Great Scott!" cried the famous voice. 18 girls vanished mysteriously from their beds at Roydown School. 14 boys disappeared from Anton. Bones are found underneath dormitory windows. Then there was a pause, punctuated by gasps from the famous voice as the newspaper's article was clearly being read and digested. "Oh, how ghastly!" the famous voice cried out. "It is absolutely frightful. Bones under the windows. What can have happened? Oh, those poor children." "But, ma'am, don't you see, ma'am?" "See what, Mary?" "Those children were taken away almost exactly as you dream it, ma'am." "Not by chance, Mary?" "No, ma'am, but there is a bit about the girls and boys disappearing from their dormitories." "You dream it so clearly, and then it actually happened. That is why I came over all cure, ma'am." "It's coming over a bit cure, myself, Mary. It gives me the shakes, ma'am, when something like this happens. It really does. I don't blame you, Mary. I shall get you some more breakfast, ma'am, and I'll get this mess cleared up." "No, don't go, Mary. Stay here for a moment." Sophie wished she could into the room, but she didn't dare touch the curtains. The famous voice began speaking again. "I really did this dream about those children, Mary. It was clear as crystal." "I know you did, ma'am." "I don't want to know how giants got into it. That was a rubbish. Shall I draw the curtains, ma'am? Then we shall all feel better. It's a lovely day." "Please do." With a swish the great curtains were pulled aside. The maid screamed. Sophie froze to the window ledge. The Queen, sitting up in her bed with the Times on her lap, glanced up sharply. Now it was her turn to freeze. She didn't scream as the maid had done. Queens are too self-controlled for that. She simply sat there staring wide-eyed and white-faced. All the small girl who was perched on her window-sill in the nighting. Sophie was petrified. Curiously enough, the Queen looked petrified. To one would have expected her to look surprised as you or I would have done had we discovered a small girl sitting on our windowsill first thing in the morning. But the queen didn't look surprised. She looked genuinely frightened. The maid, a middle-aged woman with funny cap on the top of her head, was the first to recover. "What in the name of heaven do you think you are doing here?" she shouted angrily to Sophie. Sophie looked decisively towards the queen for help. The queen was sitting staring at Sophie. Gaping at her would be more accurate. Her mouth was slightly open. Her eyes were round and wide, as two saucers, and the whole of that famous, rather lovely face was filled with disbelief. "Now listen here, young lady. How on earth did you get into this room?" the maid shouted furiously. "I don't believe it," the queen was murmuring. "I simply don't believe it. I'll take you out, madam, at once," the maid was saying. "No, Mary, no, don't do that." The queen spoke so sharply that the maid was quite taken back. She turned and stared at the queen. "Then, on earth had I come over here?" It looked as though she was in a state of shock. "Are you all right, ma'am?" the maid was saying. When the queen spoke again, it was a strange, strangled sort of whisper. "Tell me, Mary," she said, "tell me quietly, truthfully, is there really a little girl sitting on my window-sill, or am I still dreaming?" "She is sitting there all right, ma'am, as clear as a daylight, but heaven only knows how she got there." "Your Majesty is certainly not dreaming in this time." "But what did I dream?" the queen cried out. "I dreamed that as well. I dreamed that would be a little girl sitting on my window sill in her nightie, and she would talk to me." "But that's exactly what I did dream," the queen cried out. "I dreamed it as well. I dreamed there would be a little girl sitting there." The maid, with her hands clasped across her stretched white bosom, was staring at her mistress with a look of absolute disbelief on her face. The situation was getting beyond her. She was so lost. She had never been trained to cope with kind of madness. "Are you real?" the queen said to Sophie. "Yes, your Majesty," Sophie mumbled. "What is your name?" "Sophie." "Your Majesty, and how did you get up onto my windowsill?" "No, don't answer that." "Hang on a moment. I dreamed that part of it too. I dreamed the giant put you there." "He did, your Majesty," Sophie said. The maid gave a howl of anguish and clasped her hands over her face. "Control myself, Mary," the queen said sharply. Then to Sophie she said, "You are not serious about the giant, are you?" "Oh yes, your Majesty. He is out there in the garden now." "Is he indeed?" the queen said. The sheer absurdity of it all was helping her to regain her compass. "He is in the garden, is he?" she said, smiling a little. "He is a good giant, your Majesty," Sophie said. "You need not to be frightened of him." "I'm delighted to hear it," said the Queen, still smiling. "He's my best friend, your Majesty." "How nice," the Queen said. "He's a lovely giant, your Majesty." "I'm quite sure he is," the Queen said. "But why have you and this giant come to see me?" "I think you have dreamed the part of too, your Majesty," Sophie said calmly. That pulled the Queen up short. It looked a smile right over her face. She certainly had dreamed that part of it. She was remembering now how, and in the end of her dream, it had said that a little girl and a big friendly giant could come and show her how to find the 9 horrible man-eating giants. "But be careful," the Queen told herself. "Keep very calm, because this is surely not very far from the palace where madness begins." "You did dream that, didn't you, your Majesty?" Sophie said. The maid was out on it now. She just stood there goggling. "Yes," the Queen murmured. "Yes, now you come to mention it. I did. But how do you know what I dreamed?" "Oh, that's a long story, your Majesty," Sophie said. "Would you like me to call the big friendly giant?" The Queen looked at the child. The child looked straight back at the Queen, her face open and quite serious. The Queen simply didn't know what to make of it. Was someone pulling her leg? She wondered. "Shall I call him for you?" Sophie went on. "You like him very much." The Queen took a deep breath. She was glad no one expected her faithful old Mary was here to see that was going on. "Very well," she said. "You may call your giant." "No, wait a moment." Mary pulled herself together and gave me my dressing gown and clippers. The maid did as she was told. The Queen got out of bed and put on a pale pink dressing gown and slippers. "You may call him now," the Queen said. Sophie turned her head towards the garden and called out, "PFG, Her Majesty the Queen would like to see you." The Queen crossed over the window and stood beside Sophie. "Come down off that ledge," she said. "You are going to fall backwards any moment." Sophie jumped down into the room and stood beside the Queen at the open window. Mary, the maid, stood behind them. Her hands were now planted firmly with her hips, and there was a look on her face which seemed to say, "I want no part of this fiasco." "I don't see any giant," Queen said. "Please wait," Sophie said. "Shall I take her away now, ma'am?" The maid said. "Take her downstairs and give her some breakfast," the Queen said. Just then there was a rustle in the bushes beside the lake. Then out he came, 24 feet tall, wearing his black cloak, with the grace of a nobleman, still carrying his long trumpet in one hand. He strode magnificently across the palace lawn towards the window. The maid screamed. The queen gasped. Sophie waved. The BFG took his time. He was very deliberate in his approach. When he was close to the window, there 3 of them were standing. He stopped and made a slow, graceful bow. His head, after he had straightened up again, was almost exactly level with the watchers at the window. "Your Majesty," he said, "I is your humble servant." He bowed again. Considering she was meeting a giant for the first time in her life, the queen remained astonishingly self-composed. "We are very pleased to meet you," she said. Down below, a gardener was coming across the lawn with a wheelbarrow. He caught sight of the BFG legs over to his left. His gaze traveled slowly upwards along the entire height of the enormous body. He grabbed the handles of the wheelbarrow. He swayed. He tottered. Then he keeled over the grass in a dead faint. Nobody noticed him. "Oh, Majesty!" cried the BFG. "Oh, Queen! Oh, Monarch! Oh, Golden Sovereign! Oh, Ruler! Oh, Ruler of Straight Lines! Oh, Sultana! I is come here with my little friend Sophie to give you a—" The BFG hesitated, searching for the word. "To give me what?" the queen said. "Assistance," the BFG said, beaming. "He sometimes speak a bit funny, Your Majesty," Sophie said. "He never went to school." "Then we must send him to school," the queen said. "We have some very good schools in this country. I has a great secret to tell Your Majesties," the BFG said. "I should be delighted to hear them," the queen said, "but not in my dressing gown." "Shall you wish to get dressed, ma'am?" the maid said. "Have either of you had breakfast?" the queen said. "Oh, could we?" Sophie cried. "Oh, please, I haven't eaten a thing since yesterday." "I was about to have time," the queen said. But Mary dropped it. The maid gulped. "I imagine we have more food in the palace," the queen said, speaking to the BFG. "Perhaps you and your little friend would care to join me." "Will I be repulsant, Snuscumber's Majesty?" the BFG asked. "Will be what?" the queen asked. "Stinky Snuscumbers," the BFG said. "What is he talking about?" the queen said. "It sounds like a rude word to me." She turned to the maid and said, "Mary, ask them to serve breakfast for 3 in the— I think it had better in the ballroom. That has the highest ceiling." To the BFG, she said, "I'm afraid you will have to go through the door on your hands and knees." "I shall some to show you the way." The BFG reached up and lifted Sophie out of the window. "You and I is leaving Her Majesty's alone to get dressed," he said. "No, leave the little girl here with me," the queen said. We'll have to find something for her to put on. She can't have breakfast in her nightie. The BFG returned Sophie to the bedroom. Can we have sausages, Your Majesty? Sophie said, and bacon and fried eggs. I think that might be managed, the Queen answered, smiling. Just you wait till you taste it, Sophie said to the BFG. No more snuscumbers from now on. The royal breakfast. There was a frantic scurry among the palace servants when orders were received from the Queen what a 24-foot giant must be seated with Her Majesty in the great ballroom within the next half hour. The butler, an imposing personage named Mr. Tibbs, was in supreme command of all the palace servants, and he did the best he could in the short time available. A man does not rise to become the Queen Butler unless he is gifted with extraordinary ingenuity, adaptability, versatility, dexterity, cunning, sophistication, sagacity, discretion, and a host of other talents that neither you nor I possess. Mr. Tibbs had them all. He was in the butler's pantry, sipping an early morning glass of light ale when the other reached him. In a split second he had made the following calculation in his head. If a normal 6-foot man requires a 3-foot-high table to eat off, a 24-foot giant will require a 12-foot-high table. And if a 6-foot man requires a chair with a 2-foot-high seat, a 24-foot giant will require a chain with 8-foot-high seat. Everything Mr. Tibbs told himself must be multiplied by 4. 2 breakfast eggs must become 8. 4 rashers of bacon must become 16. 3 pieces of toast must become 12, and so on. These calculations about food were immediately passed on to Monsieur Papillon, the royal chef. Mr. Tibbs skimmed into the ballroom. Butlers don't walk, they skim all the ground, followed by a whole army of footmen. The footmen all wore knee branches, and various of them displayed beautifully rounded calves and ankles. There is no way you can become a royal footman unless you have a well-turned ankle. It is the first thing they look at when you are interviewed. Push the grand piano in the center of the room, Mr. Tibbs whispered. Butlers never raised their voice above the softest whisper. 4 footmen moved the piano. Now fetch a large chest, all drawers, and put it on the top of the piano, Mr. Tibbs whispered. 3 other footmen fetched a very fine Chanpedal mahogany chest of drawers and placed it on top of the piano. That will be his chair, Mr. Tibbs whispered. It is at exactly 8 feet off the ground. Now we shall make a table upon which his gentleman may eat his breakfast in comfort. Fetch me 4 every tall grandfather clocks. There are plenty of them around the palace. Let each clock be 12 feet high, 16 footmen spread out around the palace to find the clocks. They were not easy to carry and required 4 footmen to each one. Place the 4 clocks in a rectangle 8 feet by 4 alongside the grand piano, Mr. Tibbs whispered. The footman did so. Now fetch me the young princess' ping-pong table, Mr. Tibbs whispered. The ping-pong table was carried in. Unscrew his legs and take them away, Mr. Tibbs whispered. This was done. Now place this ping-pong table on the top of the 4 grandmother clocks. Miss Tibbs whispered. To manage this, the footman had to stand on stepladders. Mr. Tibbs stood back to survey the new furniture. None of this in the classic style, he whispered, but it will have to do. He gave orders that the damask tablecloths should be grabbed over the ping-pong table, and in the end it looked really quite elegant after all. At this point, Mr. Tibbs was seen to hesitate. The footmen all stared at him aghast. Butlers never hesitate, not even when they are faced with the most impossible problems. It is their job to be totally deviseful at all times. Knives and forks and spoons, Mr. Tibbs had to mutter. Our cutlery will be like little pins in his hands. Mr. Tibbs didn't hesitate for long. Tell the head gardener, he whispered, that I require immediately a brand new and used garden fork and also spade. And for a knife we shall use the great snore hanging on the wall of the morning room. But clean the swung well first. It was at least used to cut off the head of King Charles I, and there may still be a little dried blood on the blade. When all this had been accomplished, Mr. Tibbs stood near the center of the ballroom, casting his expert bolter's eyes over the scene. Had he forgotten anything? He certainly had. What about a coffee cup for the large gentleman? Fetch me, he whispered, the biggest jug you can find in the kitchen. A splendid 1-gallon porcelain water jug was brought and placed on the giant's table beside the garden fork and on the garden spade and the great sword. So much for the giant. Mr. Tibbs then had the forgotten move a small delicate table and 2 chairs alongside the giant's table. This was for the Queen and for Sophie. The facts that the giant's table and chair lowered far above the smaller table as simply could not be helped. All these arrangements were only just completed when the queen, now fully dressed in a trim skirt and cashmere cardigan, entered the ballroom holding Sophie by the hand. A pretty blue dress that had once belonged to one of the princesses had been found to Sophie, and to make her look prettier still, the queen had picked up a superb sapphire brooch from her dressing table and had pinned it on the left side of the Sophie's chest. The big friendly giant followed behind them, but he had an awful job getting through the door. He had to squeeze himself through on his hands and knees, with 2 footmen pushing him from behind and 2 pulling from the front, but he got through in the end. He had removed his back cloak and got rid of his trumpet, and was now wearing his ordinary simple clothes. As he walked across the ballroom, he had to stop quite a lot to avoid hitting the ceiling. Because of this, he failed to notice an enormous crystal chandelier. Crash went his head right into the chandelier. A shower of glass fell upon the poor BFG. It was Louis XV, the queen said, looking slightly put out. He's never been in a house before, Sophie said. Mr. Tibbs scrawled. He directed 4 footmen to clear up the mess. Then, with a disdainful little wave of the hand, he indicated to the giant that he should seat himself on top of the chest of drawers on top of the grand piano. What a fizz-whiz flashing seat, cried the BFG. I's going to be back as a snack in a rug up here. Does he always speak like that? Queen asked. Queen often, Sophie said. Quite often he gets tangled up with his words. The BFG sat down on the chest of drawers piano and gazed in wonder around the great ballroom. By Grumders, he cried, what a spliffing whoopsie room he is in. It is so ginormous. I need bizarre curls and telescope to see what is going to the other end. Footmen arrived, carrying silver trays with fried eggs, bacon, sausages, and fried potatoes. At this point, Mr. Tibbs suddenly realized that in order to serve the BFG at his 12-foot-high grandfather's clock table, he would have to climb to the top of all the wall step ladders. That's more, he must do it balancing a huge warm plate on the palm of the one hand and holding a gigantic silver coffee pot in the other. A normal man would have flinched at the thought of it. But good butlers never flinch. Up he went, and up, while the Queen and Sophie watched him with great interest. It is possible they were both secretly hoping he would lose his balance and go crashing to the floor, but good butlers never crash. At the top of the ladder, Mr. Tibbs, balancing like an acrobat, poured the BFG's coffee and placed the enormous plate before him. On the plate there were 8 eggs, 12 sausages, 16 rashers of bacon, and a heap of fried potato. "What's this place, Your Majesty?" the BFG asked, peering down at the Queen. He has never eaten anything except snow skimmers before in his life, Sophie explained. "The taste revolting." "They don't seem to have stunned his crown," the Queen said. The BFG grabbed the cotton spread and scooped all up the eggs, sausages, bacon and potatoes in one go and shoveled them into his enormous mouth. "By goggles," he cried, "this stuff is making snow skimmers taste like switchwallop." The Queen glanced up, frowning. "This was only the titchy little bite," the BFG said. "Is you having any more of this delicious grubble in your cupboard, Majesties?" "Tips," the Queen said, showing true regal hospitality. "Fetch the gentleman another dozen fried eggs and a dozen sausages." Mr. Tips swam out of the room, muttering unspeakable words to himself and wiping his paw with a white handkerchief. The BFG lifted the huge jug and took a swallow. "Ouch!" he cried, blowing a mouthful across the ballroom. "Please, what is the horrible swigbill I drink, Your Majesty?" "It's coffee," the Queen told him. "Fresh roasted." "It's a filsome," the BFG cried out. "Where is the frog scuttle?" "The what?" the Queen asked. "Delicious fizzy frog scuttle," the BFG answered. "Everyone must be drinking frog scuttle with breakfast, Majesty. Then we go all the whiz popping happily together afterwards." "What does he mean?" the Queen said, frowning at Sophie. "That's a whiz popping." White Sophie kept a very straight face. "BFG," she said, "there is no frog scuttle and whiz popping strictly forbidden." "What?" he cried. "No frog scuttle, no whiz popping, no glumptious music, no bum bum bum?" "Absolutely not," Sophie told him firmly. "If he wants to sign, please don't stop him," the Queen said. "He doesn't want to sign," Sophie said. "He said he wants to make music," the Queen went on. "Shall I send for a violin?" "No, Your Majesty," Sophie said. "He's only joking." A sly little smile crossed the BFG face. "Listen," he said, peering down at Sophie. "If they isn't having any frog scuttle here in the palace, I can still go whiz popping perfectly well without it if I was trying hard enough." "No," cried Sophie. "Don't! You are not to, I beg you." "Music is very good for the digestion," the Queen said. "When I am up in Scotland, they play the bagpipes outside the window while I'm eating. Do play something." "I has Her Majesty's permission," cried the BFG. And all at once he let fly with a whiz popper, then sounded as though a bomb had exploded in the room. The Queen jumped. "Whoopee!" shouted the BFG. "That is better than bagpipes, isn't not, Magister?" It took the Queen a few seconds to get over the shock. "I prefer the bagpipes," she said, but she couldn't stop herself smiling. During the next 20 minutes, a whole relay of footmen were kept busy hurrying to and from the kitchen, carrying third helpings and fourth helpings and fifth helpings, or fried eggs and sausages for the nervous and delighted BFG. When the BFG had consumed his 72nd fried egg, Mr. Tibbs sidled up to the Queen. He bent low from the waist and whispered in her ear, "Chef sends his apologies, Your Majesty, and he says he has no more eggs in the kitchen." "What's wrong with the hens?" the Queen said. "Nothing wrong with the hens, Your Majesty," Mr. Tibbs whispered. "Then tell them to lay more," the Queen said. She looked up at the BFG. "Have some toast and marmalade while you are waiting," she said to him. "The toast is finished," Mr. Tibbs whispered, "and Chef says there is no more bread." "Tell him to bake more," the Queen said. While all this was going on, Sophie had been telling the Queen everything, absolutely everything, about her first visit to Giant Country. The Queen listened, appalled. When Sophie had finished, the Queen looked up at the BFG, who was sitting high above her. He was now eating a sponge cake. "Big friendly giant," she said, "last night those man-eating brutes came to England. Can you remember where they went the night before?" The BFG put a whole round sponge cake into his mouth and chewed it slowly while he thought about this question. "Yes, Magister," he said, "I do think I is resembling where they said they was going the night before last. They was galloping off to Sweden for Sweden sour taste." "Fetch my telephone," the Queen commanded. Mr. Tibbs placed the instrument on the table. The Queen lifted the receiver. "Get me the King of Sweden," she said. "Good morning," the Queen said. "Is everything all right in Sweden?" "Everything is terrible," the King of Sweden answered. "There is a panic in the capital. 2 nights ago, 26 of my loyal subjects disappeared. My whole country is in panic. Your 26 loyal subjects were all eaten by giants," the Queen said. "Apparently, they like the taste of sweeties." "Why do they like the taste of sweeties?" the King asked. "Because the sweeties of Sweden have a sweet and sour taste. So says the BFG," the Queen said. "I don't know what you are talking about," the King said, growing testy. "It's hardly a joking matter when one's loyal subjects are being eaten like popcorn." "They've eaten 9 as well," the Queen said. "Who they, for heaven's sake?" the King asked. "Giants," the Queen said. "Look here," the King said. Are you feeling alright? It's been a rough morning, the Queen said. First, I had a horrid nightmare. Then the maid dropped my breakfast, and now I've got a giant on the piano. You need a doctor, quick, cried the king. I'll be all right, the Queen said. I must go now. Thank for your help. The replacer, the receiver. Your BFG is right, the Queen said to Sophie. Those 9 men, Eden broods, did go to Sweden. It's horrible, Sophie said. Please stop them, Your Majesty. I'd like to make one more check before I call out the troops, the Queen said. Once more, she looked up at the BFG. He was eating donuts now, popping them into his mouth 10 at a time, like peas. Think hard, BFG, she said. Where did those horrid giants say they were galloping off to 3 nights ago? The BFG thought long and hard. Oh, he cried at last. Yes, I is remembering. Whereas the Queen once was off to Baghdad, the BFG said, and they's galloping past my cave. Fleshland Peter is waving his arms and shouting at me, I's off to Baghdad, and I's going to Baghdad, and Mom and every one of their 10 children's as well. Once more the Queen lifted the receiver. Get me the Lord Mayor of Baghdad, she said. If they don't have a Lord Mayor, get me the next best thing. In 5 seconds, a voice was on the line. Here's the Sultan of Baghdad speaking, the voice said. Listen, Sultan, the Queen said. Did anything unpleasant happen in your city 3 nights ago? Every night unpleasant things are happening in Baghdad. The Sultan said, We are chopping off people's heads like you are chopping parsley. I've never chopped parsley in my life, the Queen said. I want to know if anyone has disappeared recently in Baghdad. Only my uncle, Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the Sultan said. He disappeared from his bed 3 nights ago together with his 5 and 10 children. There he is, the cried BFG, whose wonderful ears enabled him to hear that the Sultan was saying to the Queen on the telephone. Fleshland Peter did that one. He went off to Baghdad to beg Dad and Mom and all the little kiddles. The Queen replaced the receiver. That proves it, she said, looking up at the BFG. Your story is apparently quite true. Summon the head of the army and the head of the Air Force immediately. The plan. The head of the army and the head of the Air Force stood at attention beside the Queen's breakfast table. Sophie was still in her seat, and the BFG was still high up on his crazy perch. It took the Queen only 5 minutes to explain the situation to the military men. I knew there was something like this going on, Your Majesty, the head of the army said. For the last 10 years, we've been getting reports from nearly every country in the world about people disappearing mysteriously in the night. We had one only the other day from Panama. For the head to taste, cried the BFG, and one from Wellington in New Zealand, said the head of the army. For the booty flavor, cried the BFG. What is the talking about? Said the head of the Air Force. Work it out for yourself, the Queen said. What time is it? 10 a.m. In 8 hours, those 9 bloodthirsty brutes will be galloping off to gobble up another couple of dozen unfortunate wretches. They have to be stopped. We must act fast. Well palm the blighters, shouted the head of the Air Force. We'll mow them down with machine guns, cried the head of the army. I do not approve of murder, the Queen said, but they are murderers themselves, cried the head of the army. That is not reason that we would follow their example, the Queen said. 2 wrongs don't make a right, and 2 rights don't make a left, cried the BFG. We must bring them back alive, the Queen said. How? The 2 military men said together. They are all 50 feet high. They'd knock us down like 9 pins. Wait, cried the BFG. Hold your horseflies. Keep your skirts on. I think I has the answer of the maidens here. Let him speak, the Queen said. Every afternoon, the BFG said, all these giants in the land of Noddy. I can't understand a word this feller says. The head of the army snipped. Why doesn't he speak clearly? He means the land of the Nod, Sophie said. It's pretty obvious. Exactly, cried the BFG. Every afternoon, all these 9 giants is lying on the ground, snoozing away in a very deep sleep. They is always resting, like before they is galloping off to guzzle another helping of human beings. Go on, they said. So what? So what your soldiers has to do is to creep up the giants while they are still in the land of Noddy, and tie their arms and legs with mighty ropes and wonking chains. Brilliant, the Queen said. That's all very well, said the head of the army. But how do we get the brutes back here? We can't load 50-foot giants onto trucks. Shoot 'em on the spot, that's what I say. The BFG looked down from his lofty perch and said, this time to the head of the Air Force, You's having belly poppers, is you not? Is he being rude? The head of the Air Force said. He means helicopters, Sophie told him. Then why doesn't he say no? Of course we have helicopters. Whoopsie big belly poppers, asked the BFG. Very big ones, the head of the Air Force said proudly, but no helicopter is big enough to get a giant like inside it. You do not put him inside, the BFG said. You sling him underneath the belly of your belly popper and carry him like a torpedo. Like a what? Said the head of the Air Force. Like a torpedo, Sophie said. Could you do that, Air Marshal? The Queen asked. Well, I suppose we could, the head of the Air Force admitted grittingly. Then get cracking, the Queen said. You'll need 9 helicopters, 1 for each giant. Where is this place? The Air Force man said to the BFG. I presume you can pinpoint it on the map. Pinpoint? Said the BFG. Map? I's never hearing these words before. Is this Air Force been talking slush bungle? The Air Marshal face turned the color of a ripe plum. He was not used to being told he was talking slush bungle. The Queen, with her usual admirable tact and good sense, came to the rescue. BFG, she said, can you tell us more or less where this giant country is? No, Magister, the BFG said, not on my belly. They were jiggered, cried the Army General. That is ridiculous, cried the Air Marshal. You must not be giving us too easy, the BFG said calmly. The first titchy obstacle you meet, and you begin shouting yours, Beef squiggled. The Army General was no more used to being insulted than the Air Marshal. His face began so swell with fury, and his cheeks blew out until they looked like two huge ripe tomatoes. Your Majesty, he cried, we are dealing with a lunatic. I want nothing more to do with this ridiculous operation. The Queen, who was used to the tartums of her senior officials, ignored him completely. The BFG, she said, would you please tell these rather dim-witted characters exactly what to do? Please, Magister, said the BFG, now listen to me carefully, you two boot-bugglers. The military men began to switch, but they stayed put. I's not having the foggiest idea where giant country is in the world, the BFG said, but I's always able to gallop there. I's galloping forwards and backwards from giant country every night to blow my dreams into little chidlers' bedrooms. I's knowing the way very well, so all you is having to do is this. Put your 9 big belly hoppers up in the air, and let them follow me as I is galloping along. How long will the journey take? The Queen asked. If we sleep now, the BFG said, we'll be arriving just as the giants is having their afternoon snuzzle. Splendid, said the Queen. Then turning to the two military men, she said, prepare to leave immediately. The head of the army, who was feeling pretty miffed by the whole business, said, that's all very well, Your Majesty, but what are we going to do with the blinkers once we've got them back? Don't worry about that, the Queen told him. We'll be ready for them. Hurry up now, off you go. If it pleases Your Majesty, Sophie said, I should like to ride with the BFG to keep him company. Where will you sit? Asked the Queen. The BFG got down from a high chair. He picked Sophie up in his fingers. He swelled his huge right ear until it was parallel with the ground. Then he placed Sophie gently inside it. The heads of the army and the Air Force stood there goggling. The Queen smiled. You really are rather a wonderful giant, she said. Magister, the BFG said, "I's wishing you to ask a very special thing from you." "What is it?" the Queen said. "Could I please bring back here in the belly poppers all my collection of dreams? They's taken me years and years to collect, and I's not wanting to lose them." "Why, of course," the Queen said. "I wish you a safe journey." Capture. The BFG had made thousands of journeys to and from Giant Country over the years, but he had never in his life made one quite like this, with 9 huge helicopters roaring along just over his head. He had never before traveled in broad daylight either. He hadn't dared to. But this was different. Now he was going it for the Queen of England itself, and he was frightened of nobody. As he galloped across the British Isles, with the helicopter thundering above him, people stood and gaped and wondered what on earth was going on. They had never seen the likes of it before, and they never would again. Every now and then, the pilots of the helicopter would catch a glimpse of a small girl wearing glasses, crouching in the giant's right ear and waving to them. They always waved back. The pilots marveled at the giant's speed and at the way he leaped across wide rivers and over huge houses, but they hadn't seen anything yet. "Be careful to hang on tight," the BFG said. "We's going fast as a fizzle crump." The BFG changed into his famous top gear, and all at once he began to fly forward as though there were springs in his legs and rockets in his toe. He went skimming over the earth like some magical hop, skip and jumper, with his feet hardly touching the ground. As usual, Sophie had to crouch low in the greaves on his ear to save herself from being swept clean away. The 9 pilots in their helicopters suddenly realized they were being left behind. The giant was streaking ahead. They opened their throttles to full speed, and even then they were only just able to keep up. In the leading machine, the head of the Air Force was sitting beside the pilot. He had a word atlas on his knees, and he kept staring first at the atlas, then at the ground below, trying to figure out where they were going. Frantically he turned the pages of the atlas. "Where the devil are we going?" he cried. "I haven't the foggiest idea," the pilot answered. "The Queen's orders were to follow the giant, and that's exactly what I'm doing." The pilot was a young Air Force officer with a bushy mustache. He was very proud of his mustache. He was also quite fearless and he loved adventure. He thought this was a super adventure. It's fun going to new places, he said. New places, shouted the head of the Air Force. What the places do you mean, new places? This place we're flying over now, isn't it this Atlas? Is it? The pilot said, grinning. You are darn right, it isn't in the Atlas, cried the head of the Air Force. We've flown clear of the last page. I expect that old giant knows where he's going, the young pilot said. He's leading us to the disaster, cried the head of the Air Force. He was shaking with fear. In the seat behind him sat the head of the army, who was even more terrified. You don't mean to tell me we've gone right out of the Atlas, he cried, leaning forward to look. What exactly what I am telling you, cried the Air Force man. Look for yourself. Here's the very last map in the whole flaming Atlas. We went off that over an hour ago. He turned the page. As all in small atlases, there are two completely plain pages at the very end. So now we must be somewhere here, he said, putting a finger on one of the blank pages. We're here, cried the head of the army. The young pilot was still grinning broadly. He said to them, that's why they always put two blank pages at the back of the Atlas. They are for new countries. You are meant to feel them in yourself. The head of the Air Force glanced down at the ground below. Just look at this God-forsaken desert, he cried. All the trees are dead and all the rocks are blue. The giant has stopped, the young pilot said. He's waving us down. The pilot throttled back the engines and all 9 helicopters landed safely on the great yellow wasteland. Then each of them lowered a ramp from its belly. 9 jeeps, one from each helicopter, were driven down the ramps. Each jeep contained 6 soldiers and a vast quantity of thick rope and heavy chains. I don't see any giants, the head of the army said. The giants is all just out of sight, over there, the BFG told him. But if you'd taken these sludge-packing noisy belly poppers any closer, all the giants is waking up at once, and then pop goes the whistle. So you want us to proceed by jeep? The head of the army said. Yes, the BFG said, but you must all be very, very hushy quiet. No roaring of motors, no shouting, no mucking about, no pidgery-jokey. The BFG, with Sophie still in his ear, trotted forward and the jeeps followed close behind. Suddenly, the most dreadful rumbling noise was heard by everyone. The head of the army went a big grin in the face. "Those are guns," he cried. "There is a battle raging somewhere up ahead of us. Turn back, the lot of you. Let's get out of there." "Big Spiffle," the BFG said. "Those noises, it's not guns." "Of course they are guns," shouted the head of the army. "I am a military man, and I know a gun when I hear one. Turn back." "Those is just the giants snortling in their sleep," the BFG said. "It is a giant myself, and I know a giant's snortle when I's hearing one." "Are you quite sure?" the army man said anxiously. "Positive," the BFG said. "Proceed cautiously." The army man ordered. They all moved on. Then they saw them. Even at a distance, they were enough to scare the daily lights out of the soldiers. But when they got close and saw what the giants really looked like, they began to sweat with fear. 9 fearsome, ugly, half-naked, 50-feet-long brutes lay sprawled over the ground in various grotesque attitudes of sleep, and the sound of their snoring was indeed like gunfire in a battle. The BFG raised a hand. The jeeps all stopped. The soldiers got out. "What happens if one of them wakes up?" whispered the head of the army, his knees knocking together from fear. "If any one of them is waking up, he will gobble you down before you can say neck jive," the BFG answered, grinning hugely. "Me is the only one that won't be gobbled up, because giants is never eating giants. Me and Sophie is the only safe ones, because I is hiding her if that happens." The head of the army took several paces to the rear. So did the head of the Air Force. They climbed rather quickly back into the jeep, ready to make a fast getaway if necessary. "Go forward, man," the head of the army said. "Go forward and do your duty bravely." The soldiers crept forward with their ropes and chains. All of them were trembling mightily. None dared speak a word. The BFG, with Sophie now sitting on the palm of his hand, stood nearby watching the operation. To give the soldiers their due, they were extremely courageous. There were 6 well-trained, efficient men working on each giant, and within 10 minutes, 8 out of the 9 giants had been trussed up like chickens and were still snoring contentedly. The 9th, who happened to be the Flashlamp Peter, was causing a trouble for the soldiers because he was lying with his right arm tucked underneath his enormous body. It was impossible to tie his wrists and arms together without first getting that arm out from underneath him. very, very cautiously. The 6 soldiers who were working on the flesh lump Peter began to pull all the huge arm, trying to release it. The flesh lump Peter opened his tiny piggy black eyes. "Which of you fool pisters is wiggling my arm?" he bellowed. "Is that you, Eurostom Mercury?" Suddenly, he saw the soldiers. With a roar, he leaped to his feet. The soldiers, petrified with fear, froze where they were. They had no weapons with them. The head of the army put his jeep into reverse. "Human beings!" the flesh lump Peter yelled. "What is all you flesh pumpkin Rostom half-baked beans doing in our country?" He made a grab at a soldier and swept him up in his hand. "I'se having early suppers today," he shouted, holding the poor squirming soldiers at arm's length and roaring with laughter. Sophie, standing on the palm of the BFG hand, was watching horror-struck. "Do something," she cried, "quick before he eats him." "Put the human being down," the BFG shouted. The flesh lump Peter turned and stared at the BFG. "What is you doing here with all these grotty twiggles?" he bellowed. "You's making me very suspicious." The BFG made a rush at the flesh lump Peter, but the colossal 50-foot 4-high giant simply knocked him over with a flick of his free arm. All the same time, Sophie fell off the BFG palm onto the ground. Her mind was racing. She must do something. She must. She remembered the sapphire brooch the queen had pinned onto her chest. Quickly, then did it. "It's castling you nice and slow," the flesh lump Peter was saying to the soldier in his hand. "When I's guzzling 10 or 20 more of you mighty little megons down there, you's not getting away from me, because I's galloping 50 times faster than you." Sophie ran down behind the flesh lump Peter. She was holding the brooch between her fingers. When she was right up close to the great neck and hairy leg, she ran the 3-inch-long pin on the brooch as hard as she could into flesh lump Peter's right ankle. It went deep into the flesh and stayed there. The giant gave a roar of pain and jumped high in the air. He stopped the soldier and made a grab for his ankle. The BFG, knowing what a crowd the flesh lump Peter was, saw his chance. "You's bitten by a snake," he shouted. "I seen it biting you. It was frightsome. Points-nose viper. It was really dreadfully dangerous, windscreen viper. Save our souls," bellowed the flesh lump Peter. Sound the crumpets. I was bitten by a seditious, venomous windscreen viper. He flew up to the ground and sat there howling his head off and clutching his ankle with both hands. His fingers felt bruised. The teeth of the dread new wiper is still sticking into me, he yelled. Eyes feeling the teeth sticking into my ankle. The BFG saw his second chance. We must be getting those viper's teeth out at once, he cried. Otherwise, he was deader than duck soup. I's helping you. The BFG knelt down beside the flashlamp Peter. You must grab your ankle very tight with your hands, he ordered. What will stop the point-sponge juices from the venomous viper going up your leg into your heart? The flashlamp Peter grabbed his ankle with both hands. Now close your eyes and grittle your teeth and look up to heaven and say your praise while he's taking out the teeth of the venomous viper, the BFG said. The terrified flashlamp Peter did exactly as he was told. The BFG signaled for some rope. As soldiers rushed it over to him. With both to the flashlamp Peter's hands, gripping his ankle, it was a simple matter for the BFG to tie the ankles and hands together with a tight knot. Eyes pulling out of the frightsome viper's teeth, the BFG said, as he pulled the knot tight. Do it quickly, shouted the flashlamp Peter, before eyes piercing it to death. There we is, said the BFG, standing up. You can look now. When the flashlamp Peter saw that he was trussed up like a turkey, he gave a yell so loud that the heavens trembled. He rolled and wriggled, he fought and he figgled, he screamed and squiggled, but there was not a thing he could do. Well done, you, Sophie cried. Well done, you, said the BFG, smiling down at the little girl. You're saving all of our lives. Would you please get the brooch back for me? Sophie said. It belongs to the Queen. The BFG pulled the beautiful brooch out of the flashlamp Peter's ankle. The flashlamp Peter wowed. The BFG wiped the pin and handed it back to Sophie. Curiously, not one of the other 8 snoring giants had woken up during this shimsel. When you're only sleeping 1 or 2 hours a day, you're sleeping extra doubly deep, the BFG explained. The head of the army and the Air Force drove forward once again in their jeep. Her Majesty will be very pleased with me, the head of the army said. I shall probably get a medal. What's the next move? Now you're all driving over my cave to load up my bottles on dreams, the BFG said. We can't waste time with that rubbish, the army general said. It is the Queen's order, Sophie said. She was now back to the BFG hand. So the 9 jeeps drove across to the BFG's cave and the great dream-loading operation began. There were 50,000 jars and all to be loaded up, more than 5,000 to each ship, and I took over an hour to finish the job. While the soldiers were loading the dreams, the BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountains on a mysterious errand. When they came back, the BFG had a sack the size of a small house slung over his shoulder. What's that view've got in there? The head of the army demanded to know. Curiosity is killing the rat, the BFG said, and he turned away from the silly man. Then he was sure that all his precious dreams had been safely loaded on the jeeps, the BFG said. Now he is driving back to the penny poppers and picking up the frightsome giants. The jeep drove back to the helicopters. The 50,000 dreams were carried carefully, jar by jar, onto the helicopter. The soldiers climbed back on the board, but the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants were lying. It was the fine sight to see them, these great air machines hovering over the trussed-up giants. It was as an even finger sight to see the giants being woken up by the terrific thundering of the engines overhead, and the funniest sight of all to observe those 9 hideous brutes screaming and twisting about on the round like a mass of mighty snakes as they tried to free themselves from their ropes and chains. "I is flushing buckled," roared the Flushlampeter. "I's pleats wiggled," yelled the child chewer. "I's rock swallowed," bellowed the bone cruncher. "I goose groggled," howled the Magooger. "I's cousin wisped," shouted Meat Driper. "I's flackengled," screamed the Meat Masher. "I's lobdroggled," squawked the Gizzard Gulper. "I's crow squinkled," yowed the Blood Butler. "I's pond muggered," screeched the Butcher Boy. The 9 giant carrying helicopters each close chose separate giants and hovered directly over him. Very strong steel hawsers were hooked on the ends of them were hard from the front and rear of each helicopter. The BFG quickly secured the hooks to the giants, chains on hook near the legs and the other near the arms. Then very slowly the giants were winched up into the air, parallel with the ground. The giants roared and blew, but there was nothing they could do. The BFG, with a Sophie once more resting comfortably in his ear, set off at a gallop of England. The helicopters all banked around and followed after him. It was an amazing spectacle, those 9 helicopters winging through the sky, each with a trussed-up 50-foot-long giant slung underneath it. The giants themselves must have found it an interesting experience. They never stopped bellowing, but their howls were drowned by the noise of the engines. When it began to get dark, the helicopters, switching powerful searchlights, and trained them to the galloping giants so as to keep him in sight. They flew right through the night and arrived in England just as dawn was breaking. Feeding time. While the giants were being captured, a tremendous bustle and hustle was going on back home in England. Every earth digger and mechanical contrivance in the country had been mobilized to dig the colossal hole in which the 9 giants were too permanently imprisoned. 10,000 men, 10,000 machines whirled carelessly through the night under powerful archlight, and the massive task was completed only just in time. The hole itself was about twice the size of a football field and 500 feet deep. The walls were perpendicular, and engineers had calculated that there was no way a giant could escape once he was put in. Even if all giants were to stand on each other's shoulders, the topmost giant would still be some 50 feet from the top of the hole. The 9 giant carrying helicopters hovered over the massive pit. The giants, one by one, were lowered to the floor, but they were still trussed up, and no one came the thicky business of releasing them from their bonds. Nobody wanted to go down, and do this because the moment a giant was freed, he would be sure to run off the wretched person who had fed him and gobbled him up. As usual, the BFG had the answer. "I have told you before," he said, "giants has never eaten giants, so why is going down, and I shall untie them myself before you can say Jack Robinson." With thousands of fascinated spectators, including the Queen, peering down into a pit, the BFG was lowered on a rope. One by one, he released the giants. They stood up, stretched their stiffened limbs, and stared leaping about in fury. "Why is they putting us down? Here is a corpse-clogging hole," they shouted at the BFG. "Because you's guzzling human beings," the BFG answered. "I's always warning you not to do it, but you's never taking the titchiest bit of notice." "In that case," the flashlamp Peter bellowed, "I think he's guzzling you instead." The BFG grabbed the dangling rope, was hoisted out of the pit just in time. The great bulging sack he had brought back with him from Giant Country lay at the top of the pit. "What's in there?" the Queen asked him. The BFG put an arm into the sack and pulled out a gigantic black and white striped object the size of an arm. "Snowscumbers," he cried. "This is the repulsing snowscumbers, Magister, and that's always going to give this disgust of giants from now on." "May I taste it?" the Queen asked. "Don't, Magister, don't," cried the BFG. "It's tasting of truck filth and pig squibble." With it he tossed the snowscumber down to the giants below. "There's your supper," he shouted. "Have a munch on that." He fished out more snowscumbers from the sack and threw them down. The giants below howled and cursed. The BFG laughed. "It serves them right, left and center," he said. "What will you feed them on when the snowscumbers all used up?" the Queen asked him. "They's never been used up, Majesties," the BFG answered, smiling. "I's also bringing in this sack a whole bundle of snowscumbers plants, which I is given, with your permission, to the royal gardener to put in the soil. But when he is having an everlasting supply of this repulsant food to feed these thirsty bloody giants on." "What a clever fellow you are," the Queen said. "You are not very well educated, but you are really nobody's fool. I can see it." The author. Every country in the world that had in the past been visited by the foam, eating giant sent telegrams of congratulations and thanks to the BFG and to Sophie. Kings and presidents and prime ministers and rulers of every kind of showered the enormous giant and the little girl with compliments and thank yous, as well as sort of medals and present. The ruler of India sent the BFG a magnificent elephant, the very darling he had been wishing for all his life. The king of Arabia sent them a caramel each. The Lama of Tibet sent them a llama each. Wellington sent them 100 pairs of wellies each. Panama sent beautiful hats. The king of Sweden sent them barrel full of sweet and sour pork. Jersey sent them pullovers. There was no end to the gratitude in the world. The queen herself gave orders that a special house with a tremendous high ceiling and enormous door should immediately be built in Windsor Great Park next to her own castle for the BFG to live in. And a pretty little cottage was put up next door for Sophie. The BFG house was to have a special dream storing room with hundreds of shelves in it where he could put his beloved bottles. What is more, he was given the title of the Royal Dream Blower. He was allowed to go galloping off to any place in England. On any night of the year, he blew his splendid fizz wizards in through the windows to sleeping children, and letters poured into his house by the million from children begging him to pay them a visit. Meanwhile, tourists from all over the globe came flocking to gaze down in wonder at 9 oranges men eating giants in the great pit. They came especially feeding time when the snowscumbers were being thrown down to them by the keeper, and it was a pleasure to listen to the howls and growls of horror coming up from the pit as the giants began to chew upon the filthiest tasting vegetable on earth. There was only one disaster. The silly man who had drunk too much beer for lunch decided to climb over the high fence surrounding the pit, and of course he fell in. There were yells of delight from the giants below, followed by the crunching of bones. The head keeper immediately put up a big notice of the fence saying, "It is forbidden to feed the giants." After that, there were no more disasters. The BFG expressed a wish to learn how to speak properly, and Sophie herself, who loved him as he would a father, volunteered to give him lessons every day. She even taught him how to spell and write sentences, and he turned out to be a splendid, intelligent pupil. In his spare time, he read books. He became a tremendous reader. He read in all Charles Dickens, from no longer called dull Dickens, and all of the Shakespeare, and literally thousands of other books. He also started to write essays about his own past life. When Sophie read some of them, she said, "These are very good. I think perhaps one day you could become a real writer." "Oh, I would love that," cried the BFG. "Do you think I could?" "I know you could," Sophie said. "Why don't you start by writing a book about you and me?" "Very well," the BFG said. "I'll give it a try." So he did. He worked hard on it, and in the end he completed it. Rather shyly, he showed it to the Queen. The queen read it aloud to her grandchildren. Then the queen said, "I think we ought to get this book printed properly and published so that other children can read it." This was arranged, but because the BFG was a very modest giant, he wouldn't put his own name on it. He used somebody else's name instead. But there, you might ask, is this book that the BFG wrote? It's right here. You've just finished reading it. The end.